Today's show is sponsored by How to Fix the Internet, an original podcast from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Sometimes it can feel like we are moving towards a digital future no one wants, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are choices we can make to create an internet that makes a better future for all of us. In each episode, Cindy Cohn and Jason Kelly invite someone with a vision on how to fix the internet, someone with real solutions on how to move the needle forward towards a better online world. We checked out the Freedom to Tinker episode of How to Fix the Internet, and it was interesting to see how we can learn from open source and lessons from the past to fix future challenges. Search for How to Fix the Internet in your podcast player, and we'll include a link in the show notes. Our thanks to How to Fix the Internet for their support.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And as we record this, it is the end of the month. I cannot believe January is gone in 2023 already, but that also means this is the final look ahead show. So after the news this week, we do have our final look ahead show, and we're going to be talking about the CNCF in our look ahead. But let's dive into our news for this week. And the first news article we have actually is about the CNCF, the landscape, and about the projects and some of the more interesting and popular projects as well. So links in there for everyone to go read. I'm not going to read all of these, but they did break it up into the top incubating projects as well as just the top 10 overall, regardless of status. A couple notes that were in there that were interesting to me. Backstage. We're hearing more and more about Backstage and Spotify donating this to the CNCF and this idea of a developer portal or a developer platform. And we actually have a show coming up about that before too much longer. Thanos is another one, which belongs in the observability and analysis category, kind of like with monitoring, because it is based off of Prometheus. So there's that one. There's Istio. We've talked about Istio on the show before. And there's gRPC, to just name a few. And then if you look at some of the top projects, Envoy is in there, Helm is in there, etcd, Prometheus, Kubernetes, of course, is in there. But it was just an interesting list to me, and I certainly wanted to learn, especially about some of the incubating ones and what's something to look forward to in 2023. Coming up next for our next news article, we have another article on platform engineering. This one came to us from the New Stack, and it was an interesting, a bit of a read, definitely a little lengthy on this one, but I really liked the idea of where we in the infrastructure side of the house, where this has gone and this shift from really delivering a service, right? And that's where SLAs came from in our industry, into managing a platform as a product and how this is significant. And this is, again, we're seeing more and more written about this. This is an emerging trend we see that I think is definitely starting to take hold. I think it's something that was always there. It's just starting to become something that is a conversation topic for the industry. And finally, the links are in there, but two real quick ones. Both Intel and Microsoft, unfortunately, didn't meet their numbers and saw a decent hit to their stock prices. In Microsoft's side of the house, Azure, the cloud growth slowed to 31%, and that barely beat projections. Still brought in a decent amount of revenue, but they did have a big write-off, of course, to the resource downsizing that they had, as many are having in our industry at the moment. And Intel starting to see chip sales fall off, and we don't know, it could be partially post-pandemic, but also just everything is starting to get soft in the industry overall. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up cloud news this week. And right after the break, as I mentioned, we have a look ahead with the CNCF. And we're going to be talking to Chris, CTO at the Cloud Native Foundation. And that is coming up right after this.
Is your cloud bill out of control? CloudZero is building a platform that will let you analyze your cloud investment faster than ever before. You'll get accurate, granular visibility into your total cloud spend without the typical pitfalls of legacy cloud cost management tools like endless tagging or clunky Kubernetes support. Cloud Zero is how cloud-driven companies gain more financial control and predictability by driving immediate and ongoing savings. You can answer questions like, how can I save 20% of my cloud bill right now? Who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? Join companies like Rapid7, Drift, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. Again, please visit cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. Datadog is a SaaS, cloud monitoring, and security platform that enables full-stack observability for modern infrastructure and applications at any scale, providing teams dashboarding, alerting, application performance monitoring, infrastructure monitoring, UX monitoring, security monitoring, and log management in one tightly integrated platform, plus 450 plus out-of-the-box integrations with technologies including cloud providers, databases, and web servers. Aggregate all your data into one platform for seamless correlation, enabling teams to troubleshoot and collaborate together in one place, preventing downtime and enhancing performance and reliability. Get started with a free 14-day trial by visiting datadog.com/cloudcast. That's datadog.com/cloudcast.
And we're back, and we are at the end of our look-ahead shows for 2023, but we saved the best for last here. We are going to be talking about the CNCF today. And in order to do that, we went out and got Chris Aniszczyk, CTO for the CNCF. And first of all, Chris, on a scale of 1 to, let's call it 5, how did I do pronouncing your last name?
I'll give it a 4, since I definitely helped you out just before we started.
We have a history of names and pronunciation, so I will take a 4. That's a passing grade for us. But so first of all, welcome to the show, and tell everyone a little bit about your background.
Yeah, no, super glad to be here. We'll see where I want to start with my background, but I'll kind of give you kind of a rough history. Definitely kind of grew up as a person that loved to play video games, eventually wanted to build video games, and kind of ended up, learning programming that way. Eventually, made my foray into discovering, Linux, 25 something, almost, years ago, and started to first, obviously as a consumer, getting it all, working on the systems I had at the time, eventually getting a little bit involved in certain communities. If you remember Slackware and even Gentoo back in the day, it was kind of my early days in open source software. But that experience essentially shaped me, and I kind of appreciated my time there, where literally people out of the blue, whether it was on Usenet or IRC, would just answer the most like mundane questions I had of like how to fix my also sound drivers to whatever crazy things, and they would just help me. And that whole like experience of people coming together, to work on a piece of software and just helping each other kind of stuck with me. And kind of, that's kind of how I started my career in open source, eventually landed a job at IBM working on Linux and a bit of open source software called Eclipse and kind of low-level JVM stuff. If you remember developer tools back in the early years, it was a lot of fun, learned a lot of fun. Definitely got kind of addicted in building, developer tools and open source tools. I kind of have that quick feedback loop, even though developers tend to be some of the worst customers that you could have based on how much they complain and how little they pay you in some ways. But eventually, after a bit of time at IBM and kind of learning the ropes there, eventually quit that job to do kind of an early open source startup where some colleagues and I tried to build a essentially cloud-based provision environments almost 15 years ago based on Eclipse. The company eventually became something called Eclipse Source, but the whole idea was getting developers started quickly when they first boot up their IDE. And if we kind of look at the modern version of this today, it's essentially things like GitHub code spaces, Gitpod, etc. So it's kind of cool to see that vision kind of come around. So had a bit of open source startup experience. Eventually spent a couple years at Red Hat working on kind of engineering management, working on Eclipse and JVM stuff. Eventually quit that to work at Twitter for about a handful of years, getting them to move to the Java virtual machine, JVM, from crazy boutique custom Ruby environment that they had back in the day, and also kind of helped them with a lot of open source infrastructure. So they had a kind of a thesis back then where, hey, we're essentially an ads company. We need to scale, and what's the best way to scale? Well, let's customize all this open source software out there, because a lot of the commercial stuff couldn't fit the bill at the time. And so a lot of these projects, out there today, things you see like Parquet, Mesos, et cetera, I think kind of spurred a lot of the early movement towards open source infrastructure, since a lot of that stuff wasn't really open sourced back then. And eventually things like Kubernetes and the cloud native computing, I think, foundation were birthed based on some of those kind of feelings of like, hey, let's go share this stuff because we're actually not in the infrastructure business. So it's kind of a rough history of that. And eventually after I left Twitter, I kind of got roped into both start the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and the Open Container Initiative, which was all about standardizing essentially Docker containers at the time into standardized formats, so we don't want to have to depend on one entity for it. So it's a rough background
No,
on me, and I'm coming back from a crazy international business trip, so I'm a little bit jet lagged. So I apologize, folks, today, but hopefully that's a good background for you.
Yeah, we were talking about it before you hit record. Yeah, just so everyone knows, like, Chris is tired, and we appreciate it, and we've also had to reschedule this a couple times as well. So I appreciate you pushing through today. So tell me, what does like the day to day, like what, as CTO of a foundation like the CNCF, what exactly does that entail?
Yeah. So, if you kind of look at our latest, CNCF annual report, you'll kind of see kind of what the foundation is up to. But, from the CTO perspective, the core responsibilities are essentially ensuring our projects are happy. Right. And what does happy mean? So one is, ensuring that, they get enough support, whether that's infrastructure, whether that's technical documentation, whether that's developer advocacy, whether that is, security audits, et cetera. So we, have a couple handful of folks, that work at the foundation dedicated to essentially project services. So ensuring that they have all the resources they need to be successful. We necessarily don't do the let's call it the day-to-day feature work you'll see in projects, but we do a lot of the, let's call it ancillary stuff that, doesn't necessarily block a feature release. That could be documentation or a security audit, et cetera. And, that's essentially the core bit, of the team. So kind of my day-to-day is ensuring that stuff is healthy. Obviously, we build a lot of cool tools out there that I'm sure you've seen. I'm sure a lot of people have seen that crazy cloud native landscape or hellscape, like sometimes people like to call it, but we kind of have a team that kind of works and builds tools to make our, community more efficient, at the end of the day. So I'll kind of give you that as like the high level view. There's some other kind of future looking work, that I spend time doing. I do a lot of kind of investigation of new technologies, new areas that the CNCF may be interested in pursuing, and kind of work in tandem with our independent technical board called the TOC to kind of ensure that we have a good, healthy, let's call it lay of the land, and ensuring that the options that we provide for our community are up to snuff.
Fantastic. And let's then take that one step further. What does the CNCF kind of do these days, for those that aren't familiar with kind of the mission and the charter? And what should people expect, because there's lots of stakeholders, there's partners, there's consumers, and then there's projects, and there's events, and there's training. Like the CNCF, in a very short amount of time has grown significantly. And so, how do you see the CNCF these days?
Yeah, I mean, at our core, if you kind of go to our website, the core mission is right on the front page. It's truly to make cloud native ubiquitous and sustainable. That is our core mission. And, how we do that, there's many ways. There's things like events, right? Things like KubeCon. There's things like training, right? We do a lot of free training material. We also have official certifications, things such as like the certified Kubernetes administrator that we put together, which is a lot of work that I don't think people realize, because we have to refresh that thing every release. Obviously we have a huge community that the foundation is responsible for. We do, we help cultivate these things called Kubernetes Community Days. There's been, probably about 50 plus of those events, covering, I think we had like 7,000 people attend those. So it's truly a variety of things that we kind of, do focus on: events, training, marketing, project services, and ecosystem, development, back to our core mission of making, cloud native ubiquitous and sustainable. Part of that work is ensuring that, projects, are healthy. We have spent easily over $1 million in, producing mentorships. So projects, have a stream of new contributors and new folks contributing to the community, which hopefully could become, maintainers, down the line. We've spent probably a couple $1 million on security audits over the years to ensure that our projects are, safe and, up to date with security practices. Because, sure, a lot of people remember the Log4j incident. There's security is top of mind to folks, and we try to be a little bit ahead of the curve to ensure that our projects, definitely kind of meet, the minimum bars, out there on top of, more things that we kind of come up to ensure that the ecosystem is truly secure. So I think that's kind of the rough thing is like, we do everything in the service to that mission. And, there's a lot of different things from marketing, training, events, project services. And, a lot of our work happens, in the open. So, folks that want to improve things or participate, they just attend, any of our kind of meetings that we have. And, it is a lot of different stakeholders. Like it is a little bit crazy. We have something like 850 plus, member companies that are involved all over the world, every major hyperscale cloud out there from every country that, folks that you may have not even, heard of, even boutique cloud providers that are popping up. So it's truly kind of a bit of a unique dance that we have to play as kind of leadership in the organization to ensure all these constituents are happy, that there's a level playing field so everyone kind of compete fairly, and that the projects are, kind of in good shape so people can kind of build these kind of, let's call it commercial ecosystems. Because, when I step back a little bit, there's kind of this commercialization, flywheel that we tend to really want to focus on to ensure that our kind of, let's call it our commercial ecosystem could take advantage of. There's this thing that like CNCF, our job is to host projects, ensure they're healthy. The jobs of our members are to build products, and those products produce profits that get reinvested back into the project. So this whole like projects, products, profits, life cycle, wheel thing is that we can try to continue to push and ensure that is super successful. So that's why you see there's a lot of startups in our ecosystem. There's a lot of large companies and, projects constantly coming and going.
Yeah. And I would add too, that last bit is, excuse me, in my opinion, why the CNCF has been so successful, without a doubt. That focus on laser-like focus on let's put lots of things in there. Let's get everything, nice governance for everything. Make sure everyone, plays by the rules and also gets supported and gets air cover and air time all at the same time, right?
That's interesting because, I think there's a pro and con to it because, some people could see that view, and then sometimes we talk to some of our member companies, let's call it like more traditional enterprises, and they're like, it's like, can I just download the cloud native distro and be done? Like, I just like, it's like, sure. Too many choices. Like, why are there like 8 service meshes? Why can't there just be one? So it's this kind of thing that we battle with. But the thing is, like CNCF, we're never meant to be like the home of like a full distro, right? We're all about having the Lego blocks where our member companies could go build products or whatever distribution they can, and they provide the opinionated approach. We do not. So,
yeah, that's fair. That's fair. And actually, let's kind of segue that into a slightly different topic, but related. So there is a number of ways to represent the technologies under governance, right? There's landscape, there's technology radar, etc. As CTO, how do you think about all the different ways there are to solve all the problems?
Yeah, it's crazy. Like, at the end of the day, cloud native is all about distributed systems, and these things are inherently complicated by default, and there's many ways to do things, right? And so, if you look at our organization, yes, we have a landscape that tries to truly show all the options out there, and for all the kind of quote unquote eyesore that it could be for some folks. I actually think it is a truth telling document. Like, I think any company or person out there that tells you this stuff is super easy is lying, right? Like, there's just a lot of optionality and choice out there. We are kind of in a new wave of technology that is being built out there. A lot of it is open, so there's just a lot of choice, and I think that landscape truly is like, here's the truth. There's a lot of choice out there. There's a lot of things out there for you to play with and choose from. So, if you kind of look at how we operate, there's this kind of hidden document that we don't really surface well, but for folks that work within our kind of technical board community called the TOC, we have this set of technical principles that a lot of people don't realize that we operate, that we essentially, are all about being project centric. We rely on minimal viable governance. We try to get the hell out of the way of projects. We don't try to force, too many things, on them. We have a no kingmakers philosophy, which essentially is the result of having, 8 service meshes inside of CNCF, 4 different ways to log things and et cetera. So I think that whole enabling of competition is kind of a good thing in some ways. We also have this philosophy of no single stack. If you want your own stack, you could build it on your own. You could go to like a vendor, like an OpenShift Red Hat. Great, they have an opinionated approach. Or maybe you're like Chick-fil-A and you go roll your own crazy stuff and deploy it in your restaurants on Intel NUC. So it's like we just kind of give the flexibility for everyone to do what's best, for them. And another part of these technical principles that we've laid out is all about promoting interfaces and de facto implementations of things over traditional standards. So, for example, if you look at projects like open telemetry, CNI, and all these, even the new stuff like open feature, all this stuff is kind of is kind of being built from actual production usage versus trying to standardize something, in advance. And I think that's another kind of key success of this org is we truly try to, come up with de facto implementations based on production usage versus trying to standardize something in advance. So hopefully that gives you some insight. But essentially, I think my favorite thing is we're basically not kingmakers, and there's no single stack. There's tons of them, and the more I talk to of our end user community in CNCF, people do it different ways, and people actually, some of them really enjoy the optionality, because there is this thing where there's a lot of companies that are becoming technology companies, these days. It's, you look at a Chick-fil-A or, maybe a Walmart, a long time ago, maybe they just purely worked with, an SI out there to kind of, or purely bought off the shelf stuff. Now it's a little bit of both, right? The little bit of on, and CNCF is all about kind of fulfilling that need for folks to be able to do that.
Fantastic. So Chris, let me go back to that kind of commercial flywheel for a second, because one thing we're certainly seeing, all the headlines here recently, there's a lot of, tech layoffs happening, and you hear stories about the economy, slowing down. I could see a world in which this impacts VC funding for companies, which then affects core projects. And so does the CNCF need a certain, their own flywheel of volume of projects or providing value, or how do you think about something like that? Or are you mainly focused on just good governance of all the projects in front of you, and things like that is just a natural ebb and flow?
Yeah, if you kind of separate out the macro right now, is at the core CNCF, we're all about serving our customers, and most initial customer in mind for me are the projects and ensuring that the maintainers there are, happy, well supported, and the project is healthy. And, most of the time these projects are, I would say the folks working on them are fully employed, whether at a large, company like hyperscaler or maybe even startup. And, even in the, crazy, global, recessionary times we live in, there's been minor effect. Obviously there's been potentially some slowdown in one part of the stack, right? Maybe there's some projects that are having less maintainers work on them because, people naturally move up, the stack. So I think we kind of, that the focus tends to shift, elsewhere with new things. So I'm not too worried as long as we kind of do the core things to ensure projects are healthy. There's mentorships, there's new contributors coming in and kind of things kind of take care, of themselves. I do think, with these kind of macro conditions, there's naturally a change of focus sometimes for which projects get more attention. I think with the economy slowing down, there's been a focus on, let's say, cloud costs, right? I have a lot of friends that work in the infrastructure business at a lot of these companies, running infrastructure teams. And, for a while, it was all about, hey, how fast can we ship, features and deliver value? Now it's like, why the hell are we spending all this money on, Redshift? Can you justify it? So it's been like this kind of focus of like, hey, why are you using this? What is this actually benefiting? And so there's, obviously a focus on like cost manager now. And, there's a, at least a couple or a few projects in CNCF that are focused on that. And so naturally that attention would flow, there. And so I don't necessarily get worried. And honestly, if you look at things like, KubeCon, for example, full name of KubeCon is KubeCon Cloud Native Con, right? It's more than just Kubernetes.
Yes.
A lot of times people attend KubeCon no longer just purely for Kubernetes. It's like, they're like, we're good with Kubernetes. We want to learn more about security or cost management or, some other, new, techniques. So we've kind of diversified that event and our community as a bit of a side effect. So there's kind of always something that people are interested, because at the end of the day, like, people are modernizing their technology stacks. They're moving to the cloud. We are truly the kind of most unique place out there from an open source organization that truly has, the kind of global hyperscaler, boutique clouds, vendors, and startups all in the same place, kind of collaborating together and innovating together to kind of benefit, everyone. So I'm not too worried about the times, even though, like, there are things like travel freezes, layoffs, et cetera, that kind of, kind of are bumps in the road, but we do our best from kind of a fiscal planning perspective to ensure that we're fairly well diversified. Like, we don't depend on, let's say, one company for a majority of our revenue. We have 850 members out there.
Yeah, fair. Absolutely. No, that's super helpful. And actually, Brian and I have talked on the show in the past about, KubeCon. It's funny because it's called KubeCon, or that's what a lot of folks refer to it. But at the same time, it's not KubeCon anymore. But the cloud native, like all of that other, it's all a mouthful. And so it's funny how things have changed and morphed, but at the same time, it's still KubeCon.
There's such a wild story too of like how it all started. Like, and if people noticed the subtle details, before the conference was just KubeCon, and then it was KubeCon plus Cloud Native Con. And for a while we switched it to Cloud Native Con plus KubeCon. And obviously some of the Kubernetes folks were upset because, hey, why don't we like front and center attention? Then we switch it back. And, then we started to do with all these co-located events. So we have things like, Backstage Con, Argo Con, Service Mesh Con, Linker D-Day, Istio. So we have all these things kind of part of it. So it's just kind of funny how it's evolved over the years. Probably a whole separate discussion of just, how the naming and expansion of that kind of event reflects the state of the cloud native industry.
Yeah. And at its core, you still have the idea of, you have 820 plus members, but you have certain projects that are, for lack of a better term, I'll call your core projects, right? And even though they may be officially designated or not, right? You have ones that are just known or more popular or just have more gravity in the ecosystem, right? And so, like, if I expand that for just a second, right? For you as CTO of the CNCF. Like, how do you feel about like, okay, there's core projects and does that need more attention, or, you want to say there's no kingmakers and so everyone is equal, like, and there, I'm sure there's lots of like projects have dependencies and there's, so how does all of that interconnection work for somebody like yourself?
Yeah, I mean, at the core, there's a couple of ways to slice projects in CNCF. One, we have different maturity levels, right? So we have sandbox, incubating, and graduated projects. Your graduated projects or your folks like your Kubernetes, Vitesse, these kind of Envoy, these kind of large scale projects that are in production anywhere. And then there's kind of your more early stage sandbox projects, which are like, hey, these things may not exist in a year. They're more like kind of technological, like technology bets that are kind of put on by the technical board and the organization. And then they're incubating, which are a little bit more mature out there. So we do kind of focus resources a little bit differently across those maturity levels. Like graduated projects obviously get a little bit more funding for, security audits and a little bit more attention at our conferences. Sandbox projects, we deliberately don't market them. So if you ever go to like KubeCon, for example, you'll see all these project logos all over the place, on our banners, but there's none from the sandbox. Only incubating and graduated projects get kind of marketed and features, because we don't want to fall in that trap of over marketing something that may not be ready for wide public consumption. So I mean, I hope that kind of answers part of your question. And in terms of like forcing interconnection or interoperability, we tend to basically have a philosophy of let the market decide that. Like as an organization, forcing interop, I think is a mistake. Like basically it gets you into that trap of having like a single way or a single distribution or a single stack to do something. And some of the history of CNCF when we're kind of get started, I've been involved in open source foundations for quite a while. I've been involved with the Eclipse Foundation for 15 plus years, was helped out the OpenStack Foundation in early days, kind of get started. And so we kind of looked at, these different organizations when we kind of get started and kind of try to learn lessons, from them. And I think some of the, I don't say mistakes or missteps maybe of, let's say OpenStack was like having, maybe too much opinion in terms of like one way to do things, where there's like, hey, you're stuck with Neutron and you deal with it, right? I think we wanted to avoid that trap of like one way to do things, and like it's okay to introduce confusion potentially at the detriment of end user simplicity, and so I think that's kind of our thought process here. And like, look, if someone decides together to stitch together some projects together, like, hey, someone wants to integrate Envoy and Istio, or someone wants to create a new service mesh API called Open Service Mesh based on all this stuff, like go for it, right? And like let kind of that market decide what's best, and then we'll bubble up through the CNCF maturity levels of sandbox, incubation, and graduation. So that's kind of how I think about it. Like don't try to like over standardize something first, right? Let's get the usage out there and let people compete out there and see what truly kind of bubbles up. And we actually have like a couple examples in our ecosystem. Like one that is kind of going on now is, I don't know if people are familiar with the kind of new Kubernetes, gateway API, and there's a project called Envoy Gateway that implements that. And essentially, there's a bunch of other projects in our ecosystem like Contour and I think administrated Ingress that were kind of doing similar things. And they all decided kind of like, hey, let's go work together and let's standardize an Envoy Gateway and let's go kill off Contour and administrative project and just work on that one. To me, that's like a beautiful example of like the market kind of figuring things out, and our whole role is to kind of enable that thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another good example was where open telemetry and so on, that came through a whole mess of open tracing, open census, and all these other projects, and they eventually decided to like, all right, this is even confusing for all of us and our end users. Let's go roll up into kind of one standard that will handle, metrics, logging, traces, et cetera. So that's kind of how we think about things, if that makes sense.
And I really like how that also just reflects of it reacting to the customer base, right? It isn't just something of like, hey, this is set in stone. This is the way it's going to be. It's a little bit of like, yeah, okay. Hey, this is confusing, or this is where the industry is headed. And so let's reflect that. So I really like that. That's fantastic. So Chris, let me ask you this, because every technologist has areas of interest, right? And you recently did a post on predictions for 2023 that put a link in the show notes for this. You did a post over on LinkedIn. I will say you're not allowed to talk about FinOps though, because everyone talks about FinOps. So that one is
no problem.
But what are some of the other areas of interest in predictions and things like that for 2023 for you?
Oh. No worries. It's a shitty economy. Of course, people want to save money, right?
Yeah, that's the no-brainer. Like that one's easy. Like you can't do that one anymore.
No worries. So I think obviously maybe I'll do a few of them. So like one of them, for me personally, that I just have a lot of passion and history with is kind of development environments and how those are going to be moving to the cloud. Sooner than I think people expect. Already a lot of large companies out there, like let's call it your more modern tech companies, you're like Slack, Stripes, Uber, Shopify, Facebooks of the world. They already use cloud-based development environments for a lot of their engineering internally, right? There's none of this like, hey, we're just gonna check stuff out of some central repo and get our local Vim Emacs set up. No, these are like fully cloud-based provision development environments. And so things like GitHub Codespaces recently came out of beta, GitPod, there's Replit, there's a bunch of these kind of companies out there that are making this vision, happen where, I don't know how many times in your career you've kind of, like entered a new job or like maybe, hey, you attended a tutorial because you wanted to learn, I don't know, PyTorch. And like the first steps are always like, make sure you have all your dependencies figured out, make sure this works, or like, crap, you're missing this. You need to go download this. And it's like a nightmare to like set the basics, up, not even counting like getting your development environment configured. And so these kind of cloud development environments are becoming a thing. And, I think are just like, this is to me the year of, essentially cloud IDs becoming normalized in many parts of the industry. Because once people discover them, they're like, holy crap, this is actually faster. I don't have to spend all this time, getting this set up. And then B, you could even like share what you're working on. Like, if you run into a bug, if you ever played with GitPod or Codespaces, you could basically easily go send them a workspace where they kind of attach and you kind of go work on it together. So to me, it's like, the technology is there with like the advent of like containers and cloud native technologies kind of makes this thing a reality. So I'm personally a huge fan of that. And I think you'll see more of that with my like cynic hat on in some ways this is one choke point for let's call it some companies that truly want to lock down their employees desktop and experience. I mean, if you ever worked with banks back in the day, right, or finance, it was very common for them to have like hey, you're not taking your code home, right? If you want to go work on stuff, you have to either be in the office or like whatever VNC or whatever like securely get into work computers, through VPN, et cetera, whatever, and then work on stuff there. So like these cloud IDs allow for a modern version of that in a lockdown form. And, there'll be ways to like observe what developers are working on. Like I'm sure someone's going to integrate open telemetry into these things, and you're going to have all sorts of crazy data on like what people are doing inside their development environments in the future. So that's one. The other kind of big thing that is happening is, there's a lot of focus on supply chain security. I think open source for, the since the beginning has kind of just like, we've just kind of wung it in some ways. Like, hey, we're just going to like work on this stuff, open it, share it in public, and kind of roll with it. And I think that has worked extremely well, where most products these days, 90% of the stuff they're built on is all open source software. We're going through this kind of thing where Supply chain security is important for companies. There's regulation coming down the line. The U.S. has this Securing Open Source Software Act. The EU has something called the CRA, which is their kind of version, which is a little bit annoying because it's the same name as my Twitter handle, but all good. But essentially, governments are essentially caring about this stuff now, and that's going to result into a lot of open source projects essentially having to step up their game. Whether it's producing SBOMs, which are basically software bill of materials, like what the hell is actually in this piece of software, to maybe having some detail of who's actually contributing to the project. Are you passing certain things where you have like audits? So like typical, like I don't want to say it's typical what you're used to, like going through kind of like a SOC compliance type thing, but essentially open source software is going to have that type of moment where regulation is going to kind of force maturity in many ways, and it's going to happen, I think, fairly quickly over the next few years. Even Kubernetes now is starting to produce SBOMs as part of its release. A lot of other CNCF projects are doing it ahead. We're basically trying to get ahead of the curve here, and I think you'll see a lot of open source foundations kind of getting ahead of this in the near
makes sense.
In the near future. Yeah.
And that maturity aspect is something that definitely it's it's a double-edged sword, because to your point, none of that stuff are some of those things is not necessarily fun. But at the same time, it's showing maturity and it's enabling a broader adoption.
I mean, I don't know if everyone had the pleasure in their life to go through like a SOC 2 or like a FedRAMP type process. And, sometimes it's a little hilarious where it's just like, why are we doing this? But like, there are some good nuggets in there, right? Of like things that should be taken care of. Right. And so I think open source is kind of having that, moment. And I think I'll end with probably one more, maybe one or two more things, and then we'll kind of hopefully wrap things up. So, I'm a huge fan of kind of development portals. I don't know if people have played with Backstage, but that's kind of one. But essentially, at Twitter, we had a similar tool that we built that did this. But basically, the whole idea is like making a simple on-ramp for developers to get started writing a service, finding documentation. And just kind of having a central place for all this stuff. I think you're going to see a lot more usage of things like Backstage this year. And Backstage is like one of those weird projects where, I would say most CNCF projects, I tend to see them in like, I don't want to say tech forward companies because that may be a little bit ridiculous, but basically it's like more like your Bay Area startups, your high tech companies, will be rolling out the service meshes before your traditional banks or enterprises, out there. But with Backstage, oddly, I'm seeing it appear in more traditional enterprises almost first in some ways, like your airlines or your large banks, which is kind of a weird trend. But I am also seeing it, obviously in kind of high tech companies too. So I think it's just going to be bigger because it's such a common problem. Like once you eventually get to like more than a certain set of services that you have to manage in an organization, you just need something to kind of keep track of that. Like what are the SLAs, SLOs on this thing? Who's responsible, for it? Where can I find docs? How can I have a template to write the service? So I think things like Backstage and developer portals are going to be a big thing. Even though developer portals, I think, is a terrible name for the software. And finally, the kind of last thing on my mind, I mentioned I kind of do a lot of prototype and experimentization of technology. I've been a huge kind of investigator and proponent of something called WebAssembly, which essentially is a new, let's call it software runtime, that is essentially kind of like a sandbox virtual machine based on a lot of the work that was done in the web browser ecosystem to ensure that, your browser tabs are properly, sandboxed and so on. And so what's happening now, there's a lot of experimentation going on in that space because, hey, you essentially have a runtime that is a little bit lighter weight than a typical, container and, may have a little bit more interesting security essentially design and practices that kind of go along with that sandbox environment. And, hey, people are starting to run Kubernetes and technology and all different, kind of constraint places. So things like WebAssembly, I think, are going to be things to kind of watch and look for, because there's already kind of a bunch of startups in the space out there that are experimenting. We have a few CNCF projects, things like WASM Cloud and WASM Edge out there that are experimenting with WebAssembly. There is even our old friends at Docker, now have a, WebAssembly technical preview that essentially allows you to run WebAssembly side by side with containers. So I just view this as like a natural evolution. Like if you kind of look at software computing, it's all about like, hey, maybe if we go back to like virtual machines, we kind of, standardize on VMs as a form of kind of compute. Then we're like, all right, VMs are a little bit too heavyweight. What can we do? But boom, containers exist, right? And then some people are like, well, maybe containers are a little bit too heavy for certain workloads. Let's see what else we can find. WebAssembly. So you kind of have this natural evolution that I think happens with technology of trying to find something that is like leaner or simpler or, maybe more secure. But, like with anything, there's always pros and cons, to technology. It doesn't mean that the old stuff, goes away. I already know folks that are running VMs, containers, and WebAssembly stuff side by side. So definitely, I think that's just something to kind of pay attention and look out. I think that's going to be a kind of a generation changing technology over the next 5 years.
Nice. Fantastic. Yeah. Another tool in the toolbox is how I like to refer to it, because a lot of folks are like, oh, containers are going to replace VMs. It's like, no, it's another tool.
Absolutely.
Well, that's fantastic, Chris. Let's kind of wrap up there. I'll kind of finish this out with, if folks wanted to learn more about CNCF, reach out to you directly, figure out what you've got going on, what's some good resources and places to start?
Yeah, sure. So, for me, it's simple. You could, find me on Twitter, CRA, as long as Twitter still exists, I'll be there. Otherwise, you can find me on LinkedIn or the internet. I have a pretty unique last name. In terms of CNCF, CNCF.io kind of is our domain. It kind of has everything. And I truly love people to check out some of our events this year. For example, next week, we're doing a brand new event for the CNCF community called Cloud Native Security Con out in Seattle, February 1st and 2nd. I think, as far as I know, it is the first vendor neutral open source conference dedicated to cloud native security. And we're kind of focused on that because we have a lot of folks that attend KubeCon, and one of the kind of responses on our survey that we get is like, what are you here for? And they're like, we want more security. And we're like, all right, let's do a new event around this. So, we're expecting, somewhere close to, 800, something plus people next week in Seattle. So highly recommend folks attend that. If you can't make it, since it's a little too soon, we have KubeCon this year in KubeCon Europe's in Amsterdam in April. And KubeCon North America is in Chicago in October. So those are great events with tons of folks that show up. And, honestly, it's all about learning, sharing information, and so on. So I'd highly recommend you attend those. And then if you're kind of brand new to the ecosystem, go to our website, and also the Cloud Native Landscape, l.cncf.io, to me is a great place to just kind of see how crazy things are. There's kind of a hidden feature of the landscape that people don't really know about called the guide. So when you go to the landscape, there is a thing in the top left corner that you could switch between landscape and guide. And guide mode is all about like introductory, like how do I kind of look at this ecosystem? What is a service mesh? So highly recommend folks take a look at that. But you could always find me on Twitter or the Cloud Native, CNCF Slack, and happy to kind of have conversations with folks. But hopefully I'll see some of you at our, events. It should be pretty interesting this year with kind of the economic recession. We'll kind of see how that influences the actual program of these events. Will we have more FinOps talks? Maybe. We'll see. So thank you again, Eric, for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll double down on the CNCF Slack channel as well. The fantastic resources over there, and they do a really, really good job with that. So I definitely recommend that to everyone out there. So we're going to close out there. So thanks everyone for listening this week. And we encourage everyone, if you enjoy the show, please, wherever you get your podcasts, if you have that ability, leave us a review if possible. And of course, tell a friend as well. And so we will talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.